The story of the most ambitiously artistic series of horror films from Hollywood's golden age begins, as the story of horror movies must, with Universal Studios. Universal eased into horror through the silent era with a series of historical dramas and old dark house-style comedies. But they really came into their own, and defined the genre, with 1931's twin triumphs of Dracula and Frankenstein. What followed was a group of films that not only supplied some of the most recognizable cultural icons of the 20th century, but also set the tropes of horror films for generations, and managed to titillate and offend audiences so intensely that they were Exhibit A for the introduction of the Hays Code for moral decency in cinema. Sadly, it was not to last. James Whale, the masterful director behind Frankenstein, The Old Dark House, The Invisible Man, and Bride of Frankenstein, would massively over-budget on Showboat, leading the founding Laemmle family to lose control of Universal. The company's new owners only saw horror as the avenue for profitable, relatively low-budget B-movie potboilers. These films certainly had their moments of intense horror, weirdness, and transcendence, but were pretty solidly lurid monster movies based primarily on the interweaving stories of Universal's cadre of trademark monsters. Other studios saw Universal's success and tried to figure out what they could do to cash in on the horror B-movie market. One of those studios was RKO Radio Pictures. RKO's fortunes were always rising and falling, but by 1941 in particular, they were smarting from the fallout of Citizen Kane. The studio had taken a risk on an auteur director in a bid to become a premiere film studio. What they got is regarded today as the greatest film of all time, but at the time it was decried as an overindulgent, expensive failure that unnecessarily attacked and subsequently drew the ire of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. Hearst, in turn, brought the full weight of his influence with the public and politicians to bear against RKO. Their ambitions to be a premier studio with a premier product were crushed. With the removal of the executives who greenlit Orson Welles' expensive failures in both Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons, the new line at the studio was showmanship in place of genius. RKO embarked on a new program of B-movies, short films in popular genres that didn't make much money but turned a profit because they were so inexpensive to produce. That brought RKO to noir, jungle adventures, thrillers, and horror. RKO's horror unit was put in the hands of Val Lewton, a former assistant to David O. Selznick with an uncredited writing gig on Gone with the Wind. Lewton began with a conscientious rejection of everything that the populist Universal horror movies had become. No biting vampires, no shambling mummies, no lurching Frankensteins, no snarling wolfmen, fully lit in cobweb castles. Lewton was committed to dropping the gothic horror form and trying to bring horror fully into the modern day, in the modern setting, centered more on modern neuroses than on ghoulish old monsters. Unbeknownst to RKO, of course. RKO executives thought they were just getting a series of horror films more or less like Universal's. The conditions placed on Lewton were that his films could not exceed $150,000 in budget or 72 minutes in length, and the lurid B-movie sounding titles would be handed down to him by the studio executives. It was up to Lewton to figure out what to do with them. The result was Cat People in 1942. What RKO probably expected when they gave Lewton that title was a serviceable, lurid B-monster movie about werecats or something. What they got was a noir-like, slow-burning film that straddled the line between horror and psychological thriller. The picture opens with Oliver Reed, played by Kent Smith, meeting and eventually marrying the psychologically tormented Serbian immigrant Irina Dubrovna, played by French actress Simone Simon. What torments her is the old stories of her village back home, that in medieval times, when they were conquered and enslaved by the Muslims, many people in her village reverted back from Christianity to heathen witchcraft. When they were liberated by King John of Serbia, he put to the sword any who would not repent and return to the church. However, the most cunning and wicked among them fled to the hill country, where their lineage evolved into a line of so-called cat people, whose own wickedness and evil would turn them into panther-like creatures when aroused to passion and jealousy. Irina's own father had been mysteriously killed in the forest outside the village, and so she grew up being taunted about being one of the cat people. Though very much in love with Oliver, and he with her, this psychological torment drives a wedge between them. The two never even consummate the marriage. She is worried that her love for Oliver will turn her into a murderous beast. Sadly, this wedge opens up room for two things. The first is that Oliver drifts into the arms of Alice, his co-worker, played by Jane Randolph, who may be more familiar as the insurance investigator from Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. The second is that it makes Irina vulnerable to the advances of her suave but lecherous psychologist, played by Tom Conway. One of the things that makes cat people so fascinating and compelling is that the monster is not a monster, meaning that her psychological torment is morbid, but it is not her fault. She is a victim first of trauma, then of adultery, and then of perversity, with an underlying sense of the cat people persona being a manifestation of the indignities suffered by women. And it should be noted as well that none of these characters are chewing scenery either. Alice is honest about her feelings for Oliver, but bears no malice against Irina. Oliver only slowly reciprocates feelings for Alice, and at one key moment in the film, both Alice and Oliver agree that he has a responsibility to Irina's health and well-being. I enjoy a film where the characters act like mature adults. It's only at the end, where Conway's psychologist makes his moves on an emotionally vulnerable Irina. This all makes for a workable enough melodrama, as many reviews at the time noted, but what elevates it to horror is the question of whether or not Irina actually is a cat person. In particular, three nearly perfect scenes pull it together as a horror film. In one, Irina is following Alice home through darkened alleys, where there is nothing but Alice illuminated in streetlights and the sound of a cat-like growling from the shadows. A second has Alice floating in her apartment swimming pool while the shadows around it are being prowled by something. And finally, a third has both Alice and Oliver being hunted in the darkness of their workplace by an only barely visible panther. Director Jacques Tourneur had wanted this last scene to be purely shadow as well, but a panther was forced on him by RKO executives. His solution was to see the panther as little as possible. This magic combination of slow-burn psychological thriller and subtle noir-esque horror worked, and while Lewton's films never got the same matinee notoriety of Universal's horrors, Cat People did a respectable $4 million on a budget of about $135,000, making it RKO's most profitable film of the year and ensuring the future of Lewton's horror unit. The next Lewton picture was arguably the best pre-Night of the Living Dead zombie movie, I Walked with a Zombie, released in 1943. Prior to Zombies as Apocalypse, raised by diseases or biochemicals or incidents from outer space, thronging the planet to eat the brains of the living, zombies were merely a cultural artifact of the mysterious West Indies, a little-known, whispered aspect of voodoo whose reputation was imported from the Caribbean. Voodoo zombies were not the metaphorical horror of wide-scale civilizational corruption and destruction, but rather the metaphorical horror of enslavement projected from the actual black slaves among whom voodoo developed toward their white plantation owners. Hence the title of the seminal White Zombie in 1932. The horror of the movie was that it was a white zombie, a white person whose will has been sapped and turned into a slave. I Walked with a Zombie is not at all subliminal with this connection. The beautiful Frances D., also a wife of early RKO star Joel McCrea, plays a Canadian nurse hired to a sugar plantation on the island of St. Sebastian, so named for the slave ship that the Holland family came on to found the plantation. The ship's figurehead rests in a fountain in the plantation's courtyard, pinned with arrows of sacrificial suffering, itself an emblem of the suffering of slaves. The horrors of slavery are alluded to throughout the film. Its plot was inspired by Jane Eyre. Two brothers, played by Tom Conway and James Ellison, were both in love with the same woman, who happened to be the increasingly estranged wife of Conway's character. Stricken with some tropical malady, her nervous system was injured, and she became, for all intents and purposes, a zombie, a somnambulating catatonic who Frances D's character has been hired to care for. But is she a real zombie? That is the question that this slow-burning film leaves us with. Much like the cat people before it, there was a lingering question of, is she or isn't she? RKO executives handed down the title of the Leopard Man in February of 1943, probably just to see what Lewton would do with it. Some kind of were-leopard thing? A male version of cat people? Well, no. The film opens with the escape of a black leopard in a small New Mexico border town, followed by a series of grisly killings. Is it the leopard, or someone more nefarious working under the cover of an escaped leopard? The titular Leopard Man is actually the owner of the leopard, and suspicion does fall on him for about 5 minutes. There are some nice chilling scenes of victims being stalked in the dark, and a central murder mystery, but even director Jacques Tourneur felt the film was rather weak. It would also be his last for the series. After 3 films with Lewton, Tourneur was a proven commodity, and RKO upgraded him to A-list films. His next would be the Gregory Peck war film, Days of Glory, and Hedy Lamarr melodrama, Experiment Perilous, both in 1944. For Lewton, he carried on with the most abstract title for a film he was heretofore given, The Seventh Victim. What RKO got in return was a movie that had nothing whatsoever to do with so abstract a title. The story is more of a noir thriller than a horror movie, directed by Mark Robson, a former editor on Citizen Kane. Ironically, poor editing choices on his part result in a somewhat disjointed narrative that leaves some of the film's philosophical heft on the cutting room floor. Kim Hunter plays a teenager who discovers that her boarding school tuition is in arrears thanks to the disappearance of her wealthy sister Jacqueline, played by Jean Brooks. Hunter's character goes to New York to find her, and in so doing becomes embroiled in a conspiracy surrounding a cult of satanic dilettantes from whom Jacqueline is on the lam, lest she become their 7th victim. Though lauded by some critics today for its atmosphere of oppressive bleakness and homoerotic undertones that are so subtle as to be non-existent except in the minds of those critics, The 7th Victim did not fare well at the box office or with critics at the time. There are some daring parts about it, especially its ending, but it never seems to really coalesce into a workable film. Some of the twists are simply treated as though they had been declared without having actually been so, like, oh, suddenly this one character is in love with another character. Okay. Some of the scenes dropped from the finished picture would have furnished some motivation for this satanic cult, which ends up relegated to a final conversation at the movie's finale, when the Lord's Prayer is invoked in earnest. A thing that would not happen in a Hollywood movie today, if for no other reason than most of the audience themselves wouldn't have any clue what it was, let alone expecting it to be so affecting on a satanic cult. Even stranger is that these words come out of the mouth of Tim Conway, as the same lecherous psychologist he played in The Cat People. Originally, it was supposed to be a different character, but it was rewritten on the fly to tie Lewton's films together in a kind of vague continuity. He never seemed like the kind of character who would recite the Lord's Prayer, and for most of the film maintains a posture of resistance to the cult simply because he's too cynical to believe in any religion, even Satanism. If there are any subtext to the film, I'd think it's the subtext of 1943 and the Second World War, when the nation of Germany descended into the cult of Nazism and its satanic mass of the Holocaust, when people who don't believe in anything were confronted with the reality of grievous evil as Western civilization spiraled into utter self-destruction. Robson returned and applied himself to a much superior film in the form of 1943's The Ghost Ship. Too bad that Ghost Ship was locked away in RKO's vaults for the majority of its history. Russell Wade plays Tom Merriam, third officer on the Altair, a tramp steamer skippered by Captain Stone, played by Richard Dix on a per-picture contract with RKO. Initially, the relationship is a healthy one, with Merriam reminding Stone much of a younger version of himself, and imparting upon the younger much wisdom about the nature of authority on a ship plying the merchant seaways. Namely, that as captain he's responsible for the lives and safety of his crew, but that, in turn, confers a certain right over the lives and safety of his crew. And the captain likes a neat, orderly, and disciplined crew. What follows is a tight, claustrophobic thriller in a shadowy noir style that is a far more coherent and intense picture than the seventh victim before it. One of the crew is stricken with appendicitis, and Captain Stone is unable to bring himself to get his own hands dirty performing the operation, despite his proclamations of holding life and death of his crew in his hands. Afterwards, another crewman suggests that they put into port to replenish the crew, and the captain casually locks him in the anchor chain locker for his disobedience. This is when Miriam clues in to how Captain Stone might not be mentally solvent. The middle act is set at port, with Miriam bringing Stone up on charges, ineffectively. The cowed crew stand with their captain and Miriam is out, until a barroom fight lands him unconscious and taken back to the Altair. The final act has Miriam trapped on the ship, in disgrace, and at the mercy of the captain. In characteristic Lewtonian style, noir, psychological tension, and borderline nihilistic bleakness are mingled with maturity and subtlety. Dix does not play a slavering psychopath, and it's difficult to tell if he is truly mad and masquerading beneath the veneer of power, or merely exercising power corruptly, after too long away from the civilizing influence of society and the woman he chooses the sea over. Unfortunately, a pair of playwrights sued RKO and Lewton, claiming that the story was cribbed from a script they sent the director for consideration. In the settlement, Ghost Ship was pulled from distribution and unseen until it entered the public domain in the 1990s. It has since come to be regarded as one of Lewton's better films. The final film in this first part of the Lewton series was a return to the beginning, a sequel titled The Curse of the Cat People, released in 1944. Often it takes a classic horror series to get to the third part before going off the rails. Consider The Curse of the Fly or Halloween 3. The first sequel is just the same thing again, and the second is when they have to get more inventive. Lewton bucked tradition by going off the wall with the very next film. After all, how do you follow up a moody, atmospheric, psychological horror centered on mental illness, obsession, and an is she or isn't she central mystery? Well, you do all those things again, but in a very different shape. The Curse of the Cat People is much more of a dreamy melodrama than anything like a horror movie. We open in Tarrytown, old Sleepy Hollow, a place rich in history and supernatural mystery. It was to this sleepy village that Oliver and Alice, our protagonists from the first film, moved after their marriage. We pick up years later with Oliver and Alice's daughter Amy, a dreamy, absent-minded, innocent, misunderstood, imaginative child, a little creepy and possibly on the autism spectrum, who suffers by alienation from her classmates and her own father. When pressed to explain his concerns about his daughter, Oliver describes her as moody and sickly. Out of her anguished loneliness, Amy wishes earnestly for a friend, and lo, one appears. After seeing a photo of her father's first wife, Amy manifests an imaginary friend in the form of Irena. The overarching theme of The Curse of the Cat People is unresolved familial trauma. Oliver is haunted by his relationship with Irena, and what he perceives as her mental illness that he was so poorly equipped to deal with. Now the cycle is repeating with his daughter. He cannot understand his abnormal child, and reacting to it in about the worst way possible, out of fear that she will end up like his first wife. A secondary plot has Amy befriending the old lady in the neighborhood old dark house, a la Pollyanna. But the old lady already has a caregiver, an embittered daughter, who the old lady insists is an imposter. Against all of this is the question of whether or not Amy's imaginary friend actually is Irene. Another rich subtext to the plot is its setting. As previously mentioned, the story takes place in Tarrytown, the Sleepy Hollow of Washington Irving legend. At one point, the old lady in the old dark house reenacts the legend of the Headless Horseman for Amy, which does no favors for the impressionable girl when she is later on crossing the old bridge at night. Furthermore, the film's latter half takes place around Christmas, the traditional time for ghost stories. Today, we think of Halloween as that time, thanks in no small part to Washington Irving's autumnal tale. But for centuries, the dark time of year around the winter solstice, the 12 days between Christmas on December 25th and Epiphany on January 6th, was the time for stories of ghosts, goblins, and things that go bump in the long, long night. Think about Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. The Curse of the Cat People heightens both the is she or isn't she mystery and its fairy tale-like atmosphere with this wintry setting. There is something about The Curse of the Cat People that prefigures Jean Cocteau's dreamy and beautiful La Belle et la Bête of 1946, with its moody ethereality, its contrast of crystals and shadows, fairies and ghosts. When production wrapped on Curse of the Cat People, Val Lewton moved on to two fully non-horror films, Mademoiselle Fifi and Youth Run Wild, both in 1944. The former was a wartime period piece subtextually contrasting the Second World War with the Franco-Prussian War. The latter was an exploitation flick about juvenile delinquency. The end result was so different from Lewton's original vision that he had asked for his name to be removed from it, but that name was too bankable for RKO. After these, Lewton moved back to horror and very much enjoyed the gift that RKO gave him in the form of the greatest horror actor to ever live. In our next installment, we'll focus on the final three of Val Lewton's horror films, all of which starred the incomparable Boris Karloff.